So today I'm going to begin reading chapter 2 of this book, Alchemy by Louise von Franz. And before I begin reading it, I want to read the acknowledgement. I failed to do that yesterday, so let's do it today. The acknowledgement. This book is based on the transcription by Miss Una Thomas of the lecture series presented by Dr. von Franz at the C.G. Jung Institute, Zurich in 1959. The author and publisher are grateful to Miss Thomas for her faithful preparation of the original version. The text in its present form was edited for publication by Darrell Sharp and Marion Woodman. Darrell Sharp selected the illustrations, wrote the captions, and compiled the text. Okay, so yesterday we completed the introduction, and today I'm going to commence with chapter 2, which is about Greek alchemy. And so here it is. Lecture 2, Greek Alchemy. I tried last time to give you a brief sketch of the importance of alchemical symbolism. In the first place, it contains a collection of archetypal symbols with a minimum of personification. And secondly, there is a great deal of material symbolism from the images stored in the unconscious. To man, these images of water, fire, and metal are just as important symbolically as any personification of the unconscious. Moreover, here the unconscious psyche and matter are not yet separated. Religion, magic, and the natural sciences are not yet divided. We are confronted with the original situation where all the faculties and categories by which we observe outer and inner nature are not yet differentiated. Man as a whole looks at nature as a whole and makes certain working hypotheses in the search for truth. You will recollect that at the close of my last lecture, I pointed out that much which was formerly said about the different materials and processes in matter, we can now, having outgrown the early stages of natural science, recognize as projections of the unconscious, even though no definite conclusions have been reached about certain assertions. For instance, in a medieval document attributed to Albert the Great, there is a theory about heavy water, which looks like a completely intuitive anticipation of the heavy water we now know. Therefore, that symbolism also contains vague intuitions which anticipated discoveries of later scientific developments. Though we still do not know what was anticipated, for we do not know what further discoveries will be made by natural scientists. Ultimately, the question as to whether and how the unconscious is in some way connected with matter is, as I said, quite unsettled. We do not want to speculate and so refrain from making statements. We merely make the hypothesis that there is a psyche which manifests in dreams and in involuntary psychological ways which we can study, just as physicists say that there is something like matter or energy and study that. But we are already beginning to see that certain results are so similar. Excuse me. But I'll begin from the beginning of that sentence. I apologize for the sneeze. But we are already beginning to see that certain results are so similar that it is as if we were tunneling from either side towards the center of the same mountain. Though we have not really met yet, it looks as though we are moving toward the same goal, and therefore there is the possibility of meeting one day. You remember that I also stressed, perhaps the most important point, that the alchemists, in observing and experiencing their symbols in their written descriptions, worked without any conscious religious or scientific program, so that their conclusions are spontaneous, uncorrected impressions of the unconscious with very little conscious interference. In contrast to other symbolic material, which had always been revised, therefore, it is very gratifying to discover that the spontaneous material is akin to certain products of the unconscious in modern people who, with a natural kind of scientific attitude, a minimum of prejudice, and an attitude of inner withdrawal, observe what comes up without drawing hasty speculative conclusions, which results, however, which are very similar. The unprogrammed approach, so to speak, is common to both alchemy and analytical psychology. This time, I want to look at one of the oldest of the known texts, namely one that the prophetess Isis to her son Horus, namely one from the prophetess Isis to her son Horus, on which the sign of the sickle moon appears behind the title. But first, we should consider how we come to be in possession of such texts at all. The products of antiquity, as you know, disappeared in the Middle Ages and then were rediscovered. First, the critical sciences found them in large tomes, but for instance, the history of philosophy and philology was collected by scientists of late antiquity into books such as we would call encyclopedias or school books, which give summaries. Plato says, Aristotle says, the Stoic philosophers say, and so on. Unfortunately, compared to our modern critical scientists, these people were rather muddled. Therefore, their theories were produced in a somewhat sloppy way, making the whole thing resemble a stream of muddy water. The more ancient and the more recent writings are confused with the commentaries, which have been copied and recopied, rearranged and abbreviated, etc. And to all of this, we have fallen heir. In the uncritical Middle Ages, a selection of these texts was made from which they again quoted. Chemistry met with a like fate. Olympiodorus, for instance, of the 5th century, wrote a volume containing a collection of older sayings. We have many different works of this kind, as well as separate productions. All these were reassembled and brought into one huge Greek manuscript in Venice, and accordingly received the title of Codex Marcianus, or the Marciana, being the library in Venice. In this Codex Marcianus is assembled the whole conglomeration of old and more recent sayings, Greek material, and so on, which was published more or less as is by the famous M. Berthelot. He published the whole without such criticism, and together with M. Ruel, added a rather superficial French translation so that it could at last be printed and discussion started. Since then, more versions and more manuscripts have been collected, but that still constitutes the basic edition and the main basic text. Now, at this point, there is a image, so I want to share that image with you. It is here, and it is figure 7 in this book. this is figure 7 from Codex Marcianus, Ouroboros, symbol of alchemical work as a circular, self-contained process. Okay. Moving on. Decisions as to who was who wrote what, and the age of the different writings would be pure speculation, for some speak of the first and the others the 3rd century, differing by as much as 300 years in their estimates, and very little order has been made in this salad of tradition. As in the case of all natural sciences, there were first direct Greek traditions from Constantinople. Another stream of scientific tradition came from the Orient and returned to Europe via Spain and southern France and Sicily from the 10th century onwards. The history of chemistry is completely identical with that of mathematics and astrology and other branches such as geometry. Part went to the Byzantine Empire via Constantinople, and the rest to the Orient and returned to Europe via the Arabs. The Arabs in general were very faithful translators and added very little. They simply translated from Greek into Arabic. There were also many famous Syrian translators. Parts also went to Persia, and in the Orient, there were certain centers which translated texts. We have Greek and Arabic and later Latin texts. Where the Greek text was lost, we have the Arabic text, but conclude from the names, etc., that the original was in Greek. Then in these Arabic Muslim centers, there were the different sects who cultivated these traditions. For instance, the Shiites, a Persian sect formed in AD 644 in opposition to the Sunnis, or Orthodox Muslims. The Druzes, a Syrian people, half Christian and half Muslim, whose language was pure Arabic. Already in these Islamic centers, some few Arabs recognized that alchemical symbolism contained religious symbolism and re-experienced it as being even more religious than chemical, and added a little to it from their own experience. Usually, however, they only translate. One of the most famous of the Arabs is our Razi, or Rhasis in Latin, which developed the sciences on the chemical side. He was the famous man who introduced into chemistry the necessity of weighing matter. Formerly, it was simply said, put a little bit of sulfur into a little bit of lead, and then you have it. But Razi said, a little bit, that makes the whole difference. You must take so many parts or so many ounces of each. So one of the great accomplishments was in making exact weights and divisions, which meant a great step forward in accurate natural science. Much merit is due to him on that side, but none on the symbolic side. He was a pure technician. His counterpart in the Arabic world would be Muhammad ibn Umayl, who figures in the Latin text as Signor, or Senior. He was called the Sheikh, and in the Latin, this was translated as Senior. The old one, which would be the correct translation, so that he became senior in the Latin tradition, and only later was it discovered that the senior was Muhammad ibn Umayl. In Hyderabad, about 100 writings have been found of this most important mystic, but have not yet been published. Okay, well, that's quite a stunning statement that there's 100 texts in Hyderabad that have not been translated. That would be very interesting to know. Though it is such promising material, so few people are interested in alchemy that nobody bothers about translation and publication. So there are gold mines ahead and nobody to work on them. Some of these people have added little bits, and then, as I mentioned, there was a return through the Crusades. One of the intellectual bridges to Europe was via the Templars. They got into close connection with the Druzes, a more mystical and pagan sect within the Islamic world, who were subject to the old man of the mountain, the imam, i.e., the chief of the sect. They had a whole hierarchy of initiation, and the Templars became interested in the symbolism of their doctrine. These Druzes, probably in Jerusalem, got into close touch with certain of the High Templars and with their so-called pagan practices, for which they were later persecuted. The Druzes became infected with such sources, as well as by the pagan learnings of Frederick II, the Stauffer, at whose court in Sicily were Jewish and Islamic astrologers and mathematicians and prophets, to the great annoyance of the Pope. It was in this way, as well as through the famous island of Rhodes, where the Knights of St. John had a connection with the Orient in such places as Spain and southern France, that these writings came to be translated by Jews as well as others. They translated the texts into Latin and then began a big influx of this natural scientific tradition into Europe. The church, represented chiefly by Albert the Great, St. Thomas of Aquinas, and certain others, endeavored to eliminate the double tradition of church and natural science, and to assimilate and integrate the whole into the church doctrine, but was only partly successful in the attempt. That is just a short resume of the historical situation and the material we are confronted with. I said I would give you 3 hours on Old Greek alchemy, 3 on Arabic alchemy, and 3 on medieval Latin texts. We will begin with the Old Greek text, which is the Codex Marcianus. It probably belongs to what we call the oldest writings and is entitled The Prophetess Isis to Her Son. We know that the son is Horus, though the title does not say so. Behind the title is the sign of the sickle moon, but what that means, nobody knows. I will give you the material without speculation so that you can have the fresh impact and not what has since been said about it. The document probably goes back to about the 1st century AD. That is the communis opio of the scientists, but that is the communis opinio of the scientists, but it might be older. If you read what has been written about these books, you will find it said that they were most probably written in such and such a century, but they were certainly based on older texts, which implies some uncertainty. So let us say that the Hellenistic time, to those among you who might have the original text, I want to say that I am not using the French, but my own translation. You will remember the famous battle in which Seth blinded Horus and that Horus cut off Seth's testicles. And you know that later both were cured by the moon god Thoth and even cooperated in the resurrection of their father Osiris. You will also recollect the famous battle of Horus, the sun god who restored order, with Seth, called the Hot One, representing chaotic passion, destruction, and brutality, and so on, who was the enemy and murderer of Osiris. Seth begins, quote, "O my son, when you desired to go away to fight the treacherous Typhon, i.e. Seth, over your father's kingdom, the kingdom of Osiris, I went to Hermanati, i.e. Hermopolis, the town of Hermes, the town of the holy technique of Egypt, and stayed there some time. After the words, the town of Hermes, that is little marginal note written in the original hand, not by a later, which says, quote, she means that in the mystical sense, that is the name of the town should be understood in the mystical sense. The holy technique, hiera techna, refers to alchemy. Quote, after certain passing of the kairoi and the necessary movement of the heavenly sphere, it happened that one of the angels who dwelt in the first firmament saw me from above and came towards me, desiring to unite with me sexually. He was in a great hurry for this to happen, but I did not submit to him. I resisted, for I wished to ask him about the preparation of gold and silver." Unquote. The kairoi plays an enormous role in another very old alchemical text where the writer is Zosimos, of whom you know through Dr. Jung's comments, says that the whole of alchemy depends upon the kairos. And he even calls the alchemical operation of kairikai baphai, the kairos coloring. His theory is that chemical processes do not always happen of themselves, but only at the astrological right moment. That is, if I am working with silver, the moon, which is the planet of silver, must be in the right position. And if I am working with copper, Venus has to be in this certain constellation. Otherwise, these operations in silver and copper will not work. One cannot just take those two metals and unite them, but must also consider and wait for the astrological constellation and pray to those planet gods. And if these things are also in order, then the chemical operation might work. Taking the astrological constellation into consideration is what is meant by the idea of kairikai baphai. Kairos, therefore, at that time and in this connection means the astrologically right time, the time when things can turn out successfully. The alchemist is the man who must not only know the technique, but must always consider these constellations. Therefore, Isis says that according to the passing of these moments, one moment after the other, one has to choose the right one. And according to the movement of the heavenly sphere, which means all the movements of the planets, it happened. The Greek word, sunebi, is also a synchronistic happening of the events, that one of the angels of the first firmament cast an eye upon her and wanted to unite with her sexually. She puts him off because she wants to get the alchemical secret out of him. She makes a bargain with him and will only give herself to him if he first tells her all he knows about that. Quote, when I put my question, he said he did not wish to answer me since it was such a great mystery, the superlatively great mystery, to give a freer translation, because this mystery is too overwhelming. but said he would return next day, and with him would be a greater angel, Annihilate, who would be able to answer me and solve my problem. And he told me about this, his sign, meaning probably how she would recognize the angel, and that he would bear on his head and take it and show me a ceramic vessel full of a shining water. He, the other angel, wanted to tell me the truth. This vessel is a positon. This vessel is a positon and has no pitch in it, unquote. Now on this page, there is the fourth, the figure 8 in the book. And so let me share figure 8 with you. This is it. Isis suckling Horus. And so just put that in mind, and we will come back to that. I'm giving you the text exactly as it is. And here there is in the margin, the text, the sign. And so you see down at the bottom, this sign, which looks like a snake with a sun in the middle here. I may add that we know that this is the sign of the god Shufus. Sometimes the same sign is also used for the moon god, Chons. Quote, the next day when the sun was in the middle of the course, that is at midday, there came down the angel who was greater than the other, and he was gripped by the same desire of me and was in a great hurry. He too wanted to rape Isis, but nonetheless, I only wanted to ask him my question. She again delays, thinking only of the question. When he stayed with me, I did not give myself to him. I resisted him and overcame his desire till he showed me the sign on his head and gave me the tradition of the mysteries without keeping anything back, but in the full truth, bracket. So she wins the battle, and he tells her all he knows about the technique of alchemy, close bracket. He then again pointed to the sign the vessel he carried on his head and began telling the mysteries and began about the message. Then he first mentioned the great oath and said, quote, I conjure you in the name of fire, of water, of air, and of earth, bracket, twice a quaternio, close bracket. I conjure you in the name of the height of heaven and the depth of the earth and the underworld. I conjure you in the name of Hermes and Anubis, the howling of Kercharos and the guardian dragon. I conjure you in the name of the boat and its ferryman, Acherontus, and I conjure you in the name of the three necessities and the whips and the sword. Unquote. After he had pronounced this oath, he made me with his oath promise never to tell the mystery I was now to hear, except my son, my child, and my chosen friend, so that you are me and I am you, unquote. Stop that share for the moment then. The text is rather short. It means that it is a tremendous mystery, which Isis now gets from the angel, and which she will only be able to tell her son Horus and his closest friend. Whether her son is her closest friend or there are two people is not clear from the grammar, nor whether so that you are me and I am you means you, my son, are me, or the angel and Isis, but probably both apply. It simply means that the person who imparts that mystery to the other person fulfills at the same time the mystical union, the sacred marriage between mother and son, Isis and Horus, or that between the angel and Isis, because of each time the mystery is told, the two also become one. That is probably the meaning. Quote, now you go and watch and ask Acheron the peasant, bracket, a variation gives Acherontas. There is no transition here in the text, but probably from now on, we hear the mystery. Unfortunately, in those days, they had no signs, no quotes or anything like that. One never knows where the quote should be, but I think it is obvious that it begins here. It means that now the mystery will be imparted and you will listen to it. Close brackets. Come and look and ask the peasant Acherontos and learn from him who is the sower, who is the harvester, and learn that he who sows barley will also harvest barley, and he who sows wheat will also harvest wheat. Now, my child or my son, you have heard that as an introduction, and now realize from that this is the whole creation and the whole process of coming into being. And know that a man is only able to produce a man, and a lion, and a dog. And if something happens contrary to nature, bracket, probably meaning contrary to the law, to this law, close bracket, then it is a miracle and cannot continue to exist because nature enjoys nature and nature overcomes nature. Bracket. That is the famous saying, which also appears in many other texts, which usually as, quote, nature enjoys nature, nature impregnates nature, and nature overcomes nature, close quote, close bracket. Having part of the divine power and being happy about its divine presence, I will now also answer their questions about sands, which one does not prepare from other substances, for one must stay with existing nature and the matter one has in hand in order to prepare things. Just as I said before, wheat creates wheat and a man begets a man, and thus also gold will harvest gold, like produces like. Now I have manifested the mystery to you, unquote. At the beginning of the next section, there is something strange where it says, quote, we will prepare, unquote, and so on, speaking in the plural. Possibly it means that Isis and Horus are now already together. Then comes a classical beginning of oral and antique recipes. In German recipes begin manem, and in Greek they begin with labon, i.e. taking. Here the next paragraph begins, quote, take a quicksilver, fix it in lumps of earth and by magnesia or sulfur and retain it, bracket. This is fixation through warmth, a mixture of species, close bracket. Take 1 part of lead and the preparation fixed through warmth and 2 parts of white stone, and from the same stone 1 part and 1 part of yellow realgar. That means red sulfur or arsenic and 1 part of the red stone. One does not know what that is. Mix the whole with lead, and then it has disintegrated. Reduce it 3 times to a liquid, i.e. melt it 3 times. Take quicksilver, which through copper has become white, and take from it another part, and from dominant magnesia, with 1 part of water, and from that remains at the bottom, and from what remains at the bottom of the vessel on which has been treated with lemon juice, use 1 part, and from arsenic, which has been catalyzed with the urine of a not yet corrupted boy, 1 part, and then the cadmia, bracket, cadmia calamine in English, which simply implies a mineral which engenders fire, close bracket, 1 part, and from pyrite, bracket, also a mineral which engenders fire, close bracket, 1 part, and 1 part from sand cooked with sulfur, and from lead monoxide with asbestos, 2 parts, and from the ashes of cobatia, bracket, that is probably also an arsenic sulfide, close bracket, 1 part, and liquidate the whole with a very sharp acid, a white acid, and dry it. And then you have the great white remedy, and unquote. This continues for 2 more pages, but I will take the liberty of shortening it. I want to confront you with it, for up till now, we have not known what these words mean. Naturally, chemists have made a profound study of the text and with certain probability have been able to make out what the Greek words might mean, which substance, since in some cases there is a little description showing that they have such and such an effect, from which the chemists could deduce that a certain definite substance was indicated. But in the case of the number of other words, for instance, cobatia, which I translated as green stone, and the word which I did not translate left as magnesia, though it is not what we mean now by magnesia, we really do know what they mean. We are pretty sure they refer to some cooked chemical substances, but they are so paradoxically described in the different texts that we cannot be certain. Then there's quite a different material, namely the urine of an uncorrupted boy. Naturally, urine also contains important and corrosive substances and was used a lot, but the fact that it must be that of an uncorrupted boy, one who had not yet reached the age of puberty, shows also what a large part magical representations play. It is a general prejudice or ancient superstition that the urine of an uncorrupted boy is particularly efficient, not only in chemical operations, but in love charms, etc., where it is more efficacious than ordinary urine. It has something magical in it. I just pick on this because here we know something more than from other fields. For instance, we know that in the practice of magic, the urine of an uncorrupted boy was often used. That was an African and also particularly an Egyptian tradition. Shortly before puberty, boys are more gifted mediums, a faculty which they lose later on. Magicians who very often practiced hypnotism used other people as mediums, putting them to sleep so they would reveal the truth. For such magical and in ancient times very widespread experiments, children were preferred who had not reached the age of puberty, sometimes girls, but most often boys. And uncorrupted boys were regarded as being purer vessels of the unconscious through which ghosts and gods could speak. There are innumerable magic recipes where, for instance, it is said that if you wish to find something which has been stolen, then put an uncorrupted boy to sleep, cook such and such a thing, give him such and such a thing to eat, and then when he is asleep, ask him where the lost subject is, and while in a trance, he will tell you. that was the role of the uncorrupted boy in other fields, and therefore probably the urine of an uncorrupted boy has the same connotation here, where it is also regarded as the magical substance, since they have such associations in mind. Now I'm to the remarks, but I want to show you one more image, one more figure that's left in this part. And so this is the image, and this is figure 9, the alchemical image of the pissing mannequin and the use of the urine of an uncorrupted boy as a solvent relate to the psychological reality that the unconscious is more responsive to the naive and spontaneous attitudes associated with childhood. Okay, so that's the end of what I intended to read tonight. Tomorrow I'll work on the questions and answers to this chapter 2. Thank you for joining me today.